Tonight we continue our exploration of the wonders of neuroscience. Our subject this evening is mental illness. When our mental processes go awry, the results can be devastating. Diseases such as depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia are some of the toughest known to humankind. They interfere with a patient's thoughts, motivations, and even one's sense of self. Society has stigmatized mental illness for thousands of years. Only recently have we come to think of mental disorders as serious medical conditions. This breakthrough in understanding has improved the lives of those stricken and opened the door for important research. With proper care, many of the treated are able to lead productive and fulfilling lives. Tonight, we'll meet two remarkable women who have risen to the top of their fields despite suffering from mental illness. Redfield Jamison is a world-renowned authority on bipolar disorder, a disease she has struggled with throughout her adulthood. She is a professor at Johns Hopkins University and co-director of Johns Hopkins Mood Disorder Center. Helen was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young woman. After keeping the disease private for most of her adult life, she publicly revealed her illness in 2007. She is a professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law and founder of the Sachs Institute of Mental Health Law, Policy, and Ethics at USC. Also joining me are three scientists who have performed cutting-edge research into the biology of mental illness. Jeffrey Lieberman, he studies the neurobiology of schizophrenia and related psychotic disorders. He is a professor at Columbia University and director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Stephen Warren, his research helped isolate the gene responsible for Fragile X syndrome. He is now studying the genetic basis of the major psychiatric disorders. Helen Mayberg, her research uses scanning technology to isolate the brain regions involved in clinical depression. She has performed studies that illustrate the positive effects of deep brain stimulation on depressed patients.
Okay, people often speak about psychic pain with depression. You want to speak a little bit about that?
I think that one of the things that's hardest to explain to anyone who's not been depressed is how isolating it is, how painful it is, and that kind of pain just, I'm convinced, cannot be put into words. No matter how many great writers have tried to put these things into words, you simply cannot convey to anyone. When you think about illnesses like terminal cancer, where you would think people would be thinking of dying and committing suicide, the suicide rate is really quite low. The people who really tend to kill themselves are people when they're depressed. It is a level of agony, of arterial agony, that is just astonishing. And as I say, isolation in a sense of what's the point? You know, you don't feel human, you can't think, you can't feel, can't love.
And some people reach out for suicide.
Absolutely.
Think about it.
Steve Warren, what about the genetic underlying of this and the heredity?
So we know genetics plays a role by looking at family histories. So something like schizophrenia occurs about 1% in the normal population, but if you have a sibling with schizophrenia, then your risk goes up to about 9%. Even more striking is if you look at identical twins. They share 100% of their genome, and the risk now is nearly 50%. What's important is it's not 100% like it is with a simple genetic trait like cystic fibrosis, where identical twins, both twins, would always have the same disorder. Here, half are discordant or don't share that disease. And that says then that there's other factors playing a role, like environmental factors. You can see that also looking at non-identical twins who are essentially just siblings, but yet they have a higher risk than normal siblings because they share more of an environment. So we think of complex disease as now having contributions of the genome as well as contributions of the environment. Usually it's easier finding the genetic factors first and then trying to sort out the environment.
Even though there are a lot of genes involved here.
Well, that's the other problem, is we know that it's not one gene. We don't know quite how many genes, but it's probably a handful of genes. But what we're learning in the last several years is that the brain, unlike many other organs, presents an enormous, what we call a mutational target. There's so many proteins that contribute to how the brain works that if you disrupt any one of them, you might have a similar outcome. And so the different genes might all lead to the same phenotype, so it gets to be a kind of a hard thing to narrow down. but it's complicated. But I think now with the new technologies that have been emerged in the last couple of years, sequencing, being able to sequence genomes rather cheaply, and other technologies, at least gives us optimism that we'll be able to identify these genes in the future.
Tell me about, Kay, because you've experienced this, grief and depression.
I got very interested in grief and depression just because I had both. I mean, I certainly had a lot of personal familiarity with depression and clinical. But my husband died about 7 or 8 years ago. Yes. And I was struck then by the differences between grief and depression, even though they often get put together in the same category. That grief is something that all of us will experience, have already experienced, will experience. And depression is something that a lot of people will, but not everyone. And the question is, why do they exist and how are they different? And so I struggled with that in a book to try and sort those things out. And one of the things that's most striking about grief is that when you grieve, you feel alive, even though you may be desperately sad and unhappy and missing and mourning. You feel alive. You don't feel unconnected with the world. And in fact, you can rather easily reconnect with the world if friends come in or you go out on engagements. And in fact, grief comes and goes in very much waves when you least expect it. But it's not an unremitting state, and you don't die inside. Whereas with depression is a deadened state that's unremitting, that doesn't respond to the world around you, to the environment. You could be told the best thing in the world, the worst thing in the world, and it doesn't have that much of an impact. It's an internal state. And one of the concerns that I have, along with a lot of my colleagues, of course, is that you don't want to medicalize the human condition. You don't want to start putting people in psychotherapy or giving them medications because they're grieving. I mean, it's the human condition, and it's part of what we learn, you move on from, you learn about mortality.
So the challenge is to make sure you distinguish between the two?
That's right.
Yes, and that you recognize when people have, actually the real challenge is to recognize when people have both, so that you can treat the depression without people having to go through additional horrendous pain. You can treat that which is treatable and then leave to nature that which is nature's.
It's quite interesting because you can actually study intense personal sadness and map it and get a signature of that. Yeah. And you can actually do that same thing in people who are depressed and actually look at the difference between being depressed and situationally sad. And there are areas of the brain that are different. And what just struck me, it kind of was a light bulb moment for me right now from some of our own data, that the part that differs is an area of the frontal cortex that is responsible for the self-connectedness. And in depressed people, when they're currently depressed and they get sad, that area of the brain doesn't come on as it does in healthy people who are experiencing a past episode, recollecting a sad event.
If you look at how society responds to you if you're depressed, as opposed to when you're grieving, everyone can reach out to you, or almost everyone, unless they're complete creeps. I mean, but for the most part, people really will reach out to you if they know you have undergone a loss like a death. And they will do so. And those rituals will work for a while. They're not totally, but they will work. And society has evolved ways through religion and friendships and so forth to do that. In depression, people avoid you because it is, first of all, depression is contagious. The mood is contagious. And secondly, they have a real sense that they can't connect. They cannot make a connection with you. You cannot make a connection with them.
What is so beautiful about this is one tended to think of psychotherapy and drugs as working in very different ways. One is talk therapy, and the other is biological. And now it's clear that from Helen's studies and other people's studies that psychotherapy works on the brain. It's a biological treatment. When you and
okay, so the psychotherapy produces a biological change
in the brain. It's like a biological treatment. When you and I are having a conversation, it changes our brain. It's a biological interaction.
I was going to say, the important thing to keep in mind is when you're talking about mood disorders, bipolar disorder, depression, and schizophrenia, we're talking about a pathologic condition that medication helps to restore the neurochemical balance, but that in addition, the value of psychotherapy, and I'm going to say something that's a little bit provocative, but that it's the therapy, but it's also fundamentally the consistent, the supportive, and the healthy relationship that the individual giving the psychotherapy provides. These are the key ingredients to basically turning around mental illness and making people be able to achieve what Kay and Ellen have, as opposed to leaving a life of despair and inability to be productive.
There are a bunch of things I think help, if I might run through them. So I think, first of all, stress is bad for all illnesses, in particular mental illness, and psychotherapy helps you identify and cope with or avoid stressors. Second, it helps you develop more psychological mindedness and a stronger observing ego, so you can kind of take a step back and observe what's going on in your mind. Third, and I think this is really important, it helps you come to terms with the blow to your self-esteem of having a mental illness and being able to accept it. It's a place where you can bring your chaotic, scary, and destructive thoughts, so you don't have to say them out loud.
That's what therapy is about. That's beautifully said.
And as Eric was saying...
And know you're not alone.
That's right.
The reality also is that our current reimbursement systems, how we pay for mental health care, does not support what you're hearing as optimal treatment.
We have been fortunate in being able to pay.
They have the resources to do this.
And it's the standard of care by anybody's study of the studies. I mean, that psychotherapy and medication is better than either one alone. But the reimbursement system is such...
When we're talking about reimbursement system, we're talking about insurance companies are not recognizing this?
Insurance, Medicaid, and Medicare.
No. Absolutely.
Yes.
Medicare is too.
Now
does not. The Kay and Ellen had the resources and the families and the intelligence to know how to seek the best treatment, but standard payment for health care, if it's not out of pocket, does not pay for these services.
Despite the fact
what's their rationale? What do they say is the reason?
It's
cost containment.
It's cost containment, although it's short-sighted in the sense that one of the other major reasons for psychotherapy's effectiveness is that it doesn't do you any good to have effective medications if people don't take them. And the major clinical problem in treating bipolar illness is not that we don't have medication, it's that people won't take them.
Schizophrenia
as well. People don't like to be on drugs.
That's right, and for a lot a lot of reasons, good and bad. And so that psychotherapy helps with that. So
it helps enormously.
Psychotherapy helps keep you on your drugs.
The physician makes sure that you take it. But I think there's another point. There is, this is not an area I'm expert in, Jeff, so correct me if I'm wrong. There is a bias toward mental illness that still persists to a certain degree, and this is really reflected in the reimbursement.
Yes.
But things have gotten better with the parity bill. I mean, USC, which is covered by federal law because we're self-insured, is really very generous now with mental health care, and I'm getting quite a bit of my psychoanalysis paid for, so it's better for many people.
It's important to recognize our social policies are really self-defeating because although healthcare expenditures are a huge concern to the economy, we don't support the services that we know will reduce the morbidity and illness and the cost to society.
It's an enormous financial burden, mental illness.
tragedy.
And I think one of the reasons this is such a historic occasion, to see people with serious illnesses who, when appropriately treated, have a fantastic life and contribute importantly to society.
This is not, they are not the typical face of people that you think of for mental illness. You think of the psychotic killer or the deranged individual, not productive individuals who have successful careers.
Under what circumstances do psychotherapy and medication fail?
Is the fact that it's very clear that despite the fact that there are many, many medications that can work in individuals and a number of evidence-based psychotherapies, some people don't get better with any combination of anything that we've got. The good news is that the best treatment for depression that we've had for a very long time is electroconvulsive therapy, and that can get people out of an episode of depression where they may be suicidal and moribund. On the other hand, the more medications you've failed, the less likely that ECT will keep you well, and it has side effects. So we're in a situation that we have people that are suffering in the way we've heard described, that there is nothing that we can do, and it's a malignant situation.
What is the question you most want the answer to?
Well, personally, I want the answer to how it is that depression is mediated in the brain. What really is the source of the abnormality? We know that gene, environment, chemistry, circuits, but we're not really getting at the fundamental source of what makes negative mood progress into a state of absolute other suffering where you can't hold on to anyone else to pull you out of the pit. So that's the driving force for me.
You've heard me ask this before.
Yeah, well, the same answer too, probably. It's to go from a gene to behavior and understand all the steps in between would be fantastic, particularly something as complex as a psychiatric disease.
And how far away are we from that?
A long way to get there.
I think the question that I would prioritize is not so much a scientific one as a social one. How can we eliminate stigma? I think the greatest barrier to making gains, both at a research level as well as a treatment level, is making society accept mental illnesses, genuine illnesses that require equal treatment to other medical illnesses.
I've always been interested in the overlap and distinctions between normal mood states and cognitive states, intellectual states, temperament, and pathology. Because in mood disorders, there are very interesting similarities and dissimilarities between, in terms of what's the difference between somebody who is very high voltage, enthusiastic, exuberant, high fire, high energy person, and someone who goes on to get just the next step over in terms of not manic, but enough that it's getting disconcerting and out of control. And why do these things exist? And what is it about human temperament that is so adaptive, about having so many wide varieties of temperament, that a certain number of them that fail or get problematic? I guess trying to keep these conditions within the human condition in some sense of trying to understand them.
I mean, the easy answer is I'd like to find the cause and cure of schizophrenia, but that's a long-term project, and sort of more doable things are three. One, studying which psychosocial interventions are helpful for which people with schizophrenia and bipolar illness. Some may benefit from cognitive behavioral, some from psychodynamic. You don't have the equivalent of a drug company funding these studies, so it's harder to do them, and it's harder to do them for lots of reasons, but that's one thing.